Hi there. Welcome back to another video in the Engaging with Art series. My name is Trills, and today we are focused on voice. I've spoken a couple of times now about how I believe art is essentially communication, and so I don't think it's very surprising that voice would be a topic that I'd want to cover. When I say voice, what I'm specifically referring to is the point of view the artist is taking in expressing the intent behind their work. If art is about communication, voice is the means. Now that might seem kind of strange, and that might sound a little odd that I would even want to define something like voice, but what I want to do with this video and what I hope you will quickly see is oftentimes I believe the artist is not the one speaking directly, and that voice is something that the artist will utilize to communicate. And to begin, I want to start there. I want to start with point of view. We have a commonly held misconception, I think, in our culture that an artist is speaking from their vantage point. But I think in reality, an artist is not always, and I would argue most of the time, isn't speaking from their own voice or point of view. I think a good example of how we hold it as a misconception is music. Musicians will often write songs using first person, meaning they're going to use I terms or we terms. And naturally, we understand that to mean that they are speaking directly from their vantage point. In reality, they're often taking on a persona, or they are embodying a particular individual or something outside of themselves, but just borrowing these I terms. Take, for example, film, to try to break this down a little bit. I think we understand film much better because we see actors on a screen. We understand that those actors are human beings who have names and identities that are specific to themselves. But then when they're in the setting of the movie, they are deliberately taking on an entirely different role. We naturally in our culture will accept that, and we naturally understand that those actors in that film are speaking from a different point of view or vantage point. I think the same is true for a lot of music. I think a lot more than we realize, but the problem is when a musician is speaking in I terms and the musician's name is associated with the song or with the album, I think a lot of times it's harder for us to dissociate that. I think it's because music is an audible medium only, whereas with film we have the visual and the audible. So our willing suspension of disbelief, I think, is maybe a bit altered. I'm bringing these examples up because I think it's important and true for all of art. We look at music, we look at songs, and we have these misconceptions. We look at film, we understand it differently. And I want to bring to the fore that this is true for all forms of arts. It's important to try and discover the point of view rather than assuming it is always coming from the point of the artist. It's hard for us to dissociate the voice we hear with the ideas that are being shared because they're speaking in terms that sound as if they actually believe what they are saying or believe and hold true the notions that they are putting forth in the song, when in reality, they may be taking on or considering a different perspective. When approaching any kind of art, it's really important to remember that it is not an artist's fault that we as a mainstream culture or mainstream audience are conditioned to read things at a surface level for the sake of quick consumption. And I think one of the downsides or negative effects of that is our tendency to wrongly assume that point of view from which an artist is trying to convey ideas. I think that's a good segue into the next area I want to discuss, which is experiences. Artists are going to take experiences that they've had and are going to filter them and put them into their work, and it's going to inform what they create and produce. But at the same time, many artists are going to utilize outside experiences or the experiences of others. In the process of assessing the point of view of a particular artwork, then trying to uncover are these firsthand or secondhand experiences is another good sort of deeper step to take into that. Sometimes artists will draw from their own life experiences, there's no doubt. Sometimes artists will specifically do work that's autobiographical or just be taking from what they know and understand from within themselves. On the other hand, however, and I think a lot of times artists are going to seek and use ideas and experiences that they have maybe heard from others or that they have observed from others, or just experiences that were recounted to them that they synthesize into the work itself. The point that I'm trying to drive home here is that not everything an artist conveys, not all of the experiences and the ideas that are put forth are meant to be understood as completely from one artist's life. Not only do I think that mitigates what an artist's scope is, but I also think it does a disservice to the power of art in general. It's not to say that it's invalid or not good if an artist focuses solely on themselves. No, that's okay. But my point is, if we understand art as only to be an artist conveying their own lives, then it really doesn't allow for the observer that many artists are, or the synthesizer that artists are, looking at this outside world and being able to convey it differently through their means. I am very passionate about this topic because I find it to be very true in my own work, and so I want to bring that in a little bit. I find in my work that there's observation for me that is internal and external. I believe an artist is an observer, and that's something that I've really discovered in myself, and I really kind of like it. There are elements of my work and my process that are observational of my own being and my life and experience. But then at the same time, I'm constantly soaking in the world around me. My work then becomes sort of a back and a forth, observing myself, observing the world, and sometimes work is going to focus more on one or the other, and sometimes it's going to be varying amounts of each. I do find when the work is coming from a more emotionally driven place that it can be more personal, but again, that's not necessarily always true. That's not something that's always going to be the case. Sometimes there are multiple points of view coming from the same work. For example, the Windows series that I'm currently producing works in, that series is very much a duality of introspective understanding of my person in the struggles that I'm going through internally, just in general, and then in regards to the online world and my interaction with it. But then on the other hand, it's also this case of me looking at what happens to the human being and the human psyche and our entire beings and personalities through the lens of the online world and what it does to us and how it breaks us down. So as you can see, there's sort of this back and forth push and pull in that series. Another series in the same body of work, Digital Masquerade, is much more focused on my observation of the insincerity of the digital space and how we utilize it as human beings in relation to one another. I do draw on experiences that I've had in that series, but it's much different than Windows. Windows is the series focused more on my internal challenges and maladies in the present and working through those emotions. It's much more emotionally laden, whereas Digital Masquerade is far more observational, even the internal stuff, because I'm sort of reflecting more on my experiences and sharing them versus living more deeply in the present emotions or present struggles, if that makes sense. One other example that I want to bring in actually is a piece I did in 2016 called Selftitled. This is a very aggressive piece, and I will link it down below. I utilized myself as a model for this piece, and it's a figure with a gun in their mouth. And what's interesting is I had this piece wrongly interpreted as suicidal. I was not accused, but wrongly interpreted as it being sort of a cry in that direction. But in reality, this piece was actually about tension. I remember in fall of 2016, I had a very visceral moment where, because of some things going on in my life and some circumstances and some tension I was feeling, this image came to mind. This image and the value came to mind, this red, this violent red. And it was very much about the violence. It was very much about the tension, the violence of it. And so the piece itself does not have anything to do with suicide in the slightest, nor was I suicidal at the time, and I can say that with certainty. But the point is that this piece is about the tension and the aggression behind it, and it's not necessarily in the slightest about anything that was going on within me in a negative or sort of depressed state. Again, the only reason I bring that up is because I think that is a very specific case study of how easy it can be for us when viewing art on the surface to misinterpret and misunderstand where the artist is speaking from. My point of view when I'm producing these works is changing. My voice, the voice is changing, and the voice is not the same across these works. And again, I would argue that multiple voices are going on here, and that it's worth uncovering all of these. I find it very true for me, and I think it's true for a lot of artists and a lot of, especially musicians, working with from one album to the next, that a body of work or a series, from one to the other, there's going to be a change of voice. Oftentimes there's going to be a change of perspective, and sometimes a complete 180. So why is it important for us to understand voice in artwork? I think there are a multitude of reasons, and I think, like I was just saying, a big one is to remember that not all art is a cry for help. I think it's important to remember that artists are okay a lot of times. And so just because work seems more aggressive or violent or angry or howsoever you want to look at it, that's not always the case that the artist is feeling that way within themselves. Another big reason to understand voice is because if we understand the voice from which the artist is speaking, then we can put ourselves in that perspective as well. In some cases, this creates an opportunity for sympathy or maybe even empathy if these are experiences that you can relate to. An artist is creating a perspective or a point of view for us to walk into in experiencing that artwork. It's important to discover voice because the artist may be wanting to put us directly in the shoes of another. Or, like I said, there are instances where the artist wants to put us into their shoes specifically. Just because I've been speaking about all things not necessarily being from an artist's perspective, obviously it is true that the artist is going to speak from their perspective from time to time. It's this pursuit of voice that will help us to delineate that and to better understand exactly how to understand what we are receiving and experiencing the work. This whole conversation wraps back to intent, as I discussed a few videos ago. Sometimes the intent of an artwork is specifically to place us in a particular point of view, particularly to draw us to a voice and hear the voice of others we wouldn't necessarily hear. I think oftentimes voice is a major part of the intent of an artist's work because the artist is trying not only to communicate, but to communicate from a perspective and in a certain specific way. And that's why it's so important for us to understand it, because it's very near the heart of how art is functioning with us. And that brings me to what I really think is the heart of this discussion, and that is that at the core of all art is a human being, a human individual seeking to communicate. No matter what outside or external or corporate or corporal shackles that sort of infiltrate and try to muddy the work and muddy the waters, at the heart of all artwork is going to be a human being trying to communicate. This is going to draw us into the next video. And so that's why I want to leave you with that idea. But that's the point, is it's always worth seeking that human being at the core of the artwork. No matter what medium it is, no matter how different it may seem in terms of artistic expression, that's just what I want you to consider as we move out of this video and looking forward to the next. Thank you all so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and please feel free to share it with anybody else who might find it worthwhile. So thank you again, everybody, and until the next one, bye-bye.